The following program does not necessarily represent the views and opinions of Reality Radio 101, its advertisers and sponsors, or its listening audience. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to the Bear Psychology Radio Show with psychologist, author, and speaker, Dr. Anna Baranowski, where mind, mood, and what matters to you are discussed. We're broadcasting live from Toronto, Ontario, Canada, on Reality Radio 101. Our email address is instudio101@gmail.com. And now, your host of the Bear Psychology Radio Show, Dr. Anna Baranowski.
Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be back with you again today. I am really delighted because I just got some very interesting news from our radio producer par excellence, Gary, who just told me we've got over 5,000 live listeners. And I am absolutely thrilled because not only are you with us in these programs, but you're asking such pertinent, such important, such essential questions when our live authors come and join us, that it just makes a very compelling, a very interesting interview and conversation. And you know, I'm really thrilled that you're with us, and I love doing this show. I have to apologize for our last show where we were having technical difficulties, and being a live broadcast and running for many years now, this was the very first time ever that we'd had a problem with our live show. And I have to say, we're going to have our wonderful author from our last show back on because we didn't get a chance to finish the show. But this week we have a really important conversation to have regarding medical assistance in dying. And this is a big topic in Canada and in different places in the world. And we have an expert with a personal story who's involved in this field in Canada, but has also written an important book called The Many Faces of MAID, and MAID stands for Medical Assistance in Dying. That's how it's referred to in Canada. And the subtitle is What to Expect When Someone You Know Chooses Medical Assistance in Dying. The authors are Cynthia Clark, who's with us today, and Carol Cram. And I just have to say, it's such a big topic. In my practice, I'm talking to more and more individuals who have actually already said goodbye to a loved one who has gone the route of MAID or is contemplating MAID for themselves or knows somebody contemplating MAID. And because it's becoming more of our conversation, anybody for sure in clinical practice will have a story like this. So I want to thank you so much, Cynthia. You and I have spoken before. I know you're well versed in this work. So I want to thank you for continuing the good work you're doing and also joining us today in this conversation. And I want to encourage our wonderful listeners especially if you're grappling with this type of an issue, to feel free to email us during the show at instudio101@gmail.com. We definitely want to hear from you, join in the conversation, and help us to understand, what you're dealing with. And also, if you have any questions, thank you so much, Cynthia, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to chat with you.
Yes, it was great. We had a previous conversation, and I was really happy that you were able to join us in this, this serious topic. And, I know you have your own story, and that you worked very hard to pull this book together, and all of I think there's 17 stories in the book itself. And one of the stories is about really your own experience with MAID in your own family. But maybe we can start with, what MAID actually is and why somebody might choose MAID.
Sure. Maybe I'll just preface this with, I am not a physician or a medical practitioner. I am a person with lived experience and someone who is passionate about making sure people understand what it is and what it isn't, and feel supported when their loved ones are making these choices. And I'm also a passionate advocate for having open, honest conversations about difficult topics, including death and dying. So, so what was your question? What is MAID?
Yeah.
And I guess for me in Canada, it's someone's legal right to be assessed for a medical assistance in death. It's not necessarily their legal right to have it, but they have a right to be assessed to see if they meet the eligibility criteria. And in my experience, twice now, actually, it's been a way to say goodbye to a dying loved one in a more controlled fashion, in a way that my loved ones have felt empowered and given the opportunity to leave this world on their own terms.
Mm-hmm. Why is that important, leaving on your own terms?
For my loved ones, it was important. The first time it was with my husband, and we had young kids, and it was important for him that his kids saw him or remembered him in a way that he wanted to be remembered, in a way that he had lived most of his life, being healthy, being able to communicate with them, being able to live at home, and being able to say goodbye. And in my father's case, similarly, it was about autonomy, being able to have sort of this safety net, really, knowing that as he progressed through his illness and his treatment, that he knew if he got to a point where it didn't feel tolerable or manageable anymore, that he had this choice. That gave my father especially a lot of comfort. And there was quite a while where I wasn't really sure if he would end up choosing it, but he really benefited from knowing that he'd been approved and he could if he wanted to. I think there's so much lack of control for patients that they're grappling with losing, the life that they imagined for themselves. They're grappling with a reality that they weren't expecting, and with a prognosis and a trajectory that's really unknown. And it can feel really nice to have some control over something amongst all of these unknowns, and to the idea that no matter what happens, like, you get to decide and you can choose. It's enough when you want to, is quite empowering. At least that's what I observed in my home.
Yeah, I understand when you said, you're a passionate advocate of having difficult conversations, facing difficult topics, and this is certainly one of them, because people can encounter this with so much confusion and grief and sadness and anger and guilt. It's just the range of emotions is just, it's like an onslaught. And as I mentioned before, I'm hearing more and more about this from people in my own practice, and, just the feelings of uncertainty, and even feeling guilty about having feelings that they are having, the natural feelings that come to the surface, and what that really looks like, and everything that goes along with it, including people who are choosing MAID, who are angry that maybe the process isn't as smooth as they would want it to be. And you had mentioned something about the right to be assessed, versus the right to actually be offered MAID. And maybe you can help us understand that. What's the difference between the right to being assessed versus the right to have MAID?
Well, so in Canada, MAID is a medical procedure that is offered, or can be not offered, sorry. It's a medical procedure that can be provided by medical doctors and nurse practitioners. But those doctors are bound by a code of ethics and by the Criminal Code of Canada. And the constitutional change that happened that allowed MAID to become legal, it was a challenge in the courts that said it's unconstitutional to not be allowed assistance to die. And so the court struck down and required the government to change the criminal code, which then required the government to put into place some parameters. And so our rights as Canadians is to apply and say, hey, I would like support or help in dying. But those physicians who are willing to help us are required to make sure that we meet the criteria that have been set out by the government in order to receive that help. So it's not our right to have medical assistance in dying, it's our right to be assessed and see if we meet the eligibility criteria. And once those criteria are met, then of course you can have medical assistance in dying, but you can't just have it. I mean, that would be asking a physician to go against the Criminal Code of Canada and put their medical license on the line, right? So,
okay. So can you help our listeners understand what it means to be eligible? I mean, who can actually meet the criterion? What are the criterion and why?
So the eligibility criteria are: you need to be 18 years of age or older. You need to be eligible for publicly funded healthcare in Canada. You need to make a voluntary request, which is in the form of a signed document that you submit as your record of request. You need to have the capacity to make your own healthcare decisions. You need to provide informed consent. And you need to be diagnosed with a grievous and irremediable medical condition, which includes meeting these criteria: serious and incurable illness, disease, or disability, advanced state of irreversible decline in capability, and experiencing enduring physical and psychological suffering that's caused by your illness, disease, or disability, or the advanced state of decline in capability that is deemed intolerable to the patient and cannot be relieved under conditions that they themselves consider acceptable.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Now, that means that, somebody cannot simply, first of all, come to Canada from another country and apply through our system, right?
Correct.
And also that, if they are facing a terminal illness, at the beginning, they might not even meet the criterion. It might have to progress somewhat before they can actually have MAID applied.
So I just want to again say I'm not a medical practitioner or a MAID provider. And so
Yeah.
I'm not regularly faced with having to determine people's eligibility. But those requirements that I just stated are listed on the Government of Canada website and are practiced by MAID practitioners, assessors, and providers. There's an organization in Canada called the Canadian Association of MAID Assessors and Providers who gives guidance and has an entire curriculum that is free for people who want to be MAID assessors and providers, that helps them work through correctly and properly assessing people for MAID. And I guess I should mention that after a written request is submitted, so this isn't just chatting with your doctor about MAID. You know, anybody can do that and learn and have information, but then a patient has to sign and have witnessed a request for MAID, have it submitted, and then two independent practitioners need to meet with that patient and confirm that the patient meets all of those eligibility criteria before they can choose a date and go ahead with MAID.
Right. But it gets kind of filed so that they can come back to it at another time if that is appropriate. It seems to me like in
Yeah.
most cases, at least the cases that I am seeing, people apply for MAID and then they wait until the time that it seems most appropriate.
Correct. So you can apply and then you can be assessed. And once you have been deemed eligible, it's up to you when you decide you're ready to proceed
Got
or
it.
ready to set a date and go ahead. So, for example, in my husband's case, over 5 years ago, I think there was a lot less information and MAID was newer. And, you know, we sort of were under the impression you really had to be ready to die when you applied, which made it quite difficult and onerous for the patient, very emotional, challenging to, you know, have an hour or an hour and a half to meet with two different practitioners and sort of plead your case. It was hard to use so much time and energy when you're sick and close to dying to do that. And you know, something I learned in that process, and I think my father learned by watching us go through that process, when he was diagnosed, he understood I can apply earlier than I'm ready. And he was approved and continued with treatment and continued until such time his treatment wasn't working. And then he even accessed some palliative care resources. And, you know, there was no pressure. When he reached a state where he decided he was ready, he picked up the phone and contacted the MAID navigation team here and said, okay, I'm ready now. But it gave him a lot of comfort just knowing that he could do that when he was ready, if he wanted to.
Right. Right. It seems to me that it's a particularly emotional experience to face. I wonder, Cynthia, if you can tell us a little bit about what it took for you and your family to face all of this, if you are willing to share that with us.
Sure, of course I can. I would say that MAID itself wasn't necessarily what made the experience of losing a husband when you're young and have young children specifically difficult or emotional or challenging. I mean, it was an added challenge to an already tragic and frustrating situation. That's not how I expected life to go. I think that it's a little bit surreal. It's a gift to know that you can watch your loved one have some autonomy, have some choice and control. I genuinely believe that, you know, holding my husband while he died on a date of his choosing was a far more acceptable experience than sort of seeing his slow decline into a disease that he didn't choose. But sure, knowing for a week that on X date at X time exactly is when your loved one will die is very mind-numbing and strange and surreal.
Yeah, I'm so sorry you and your family and children had to go through that. It sounds like it was a pretty hard thing to face, and I guess you've really learned a lot about facing tough things, because you know there's no way to go through something like that without it shaping you in some very particular ways. Can you share how that shaped you facing something like that?
Oh boy. It's hard to know how it didn't shape me, because you're right. I mean, it just sort of rocks your world, doesn't it?
I
How has
imagine.
it shaped me? I think it's definitely given myself and my children a perspective on what matters and what doesn't in life.
Oh, wow. Oh, wow. That's really amazing to hear that. What does matter after this?
Well, I would say, so I will share one of my children is currently, doing hockey evaluations, and there's a lot of really nervous kids, nervous about meeting their own expectations for themselves, their parents' expectations for themselves, their teammates and coaches' expectations. And I think that, one of my children in particular has a very healthy perspective that whatever, this is about having fun and doing my best because I want to be here. And, we frequently remind one another, is this the hardest thing you've ever done? No. Have you done harder? Yes. Will you do harder in the future? Maybe. But is this the thing that needs a whole lot of our worry or attention? No, probably not. And it's a little bit liberating to be able to go try new things, switch sports, try a new class at school, speak on live radio about personal and intimate topics. Because, yeah, what does really matter, I guess, who we decide to be and what kind of lemonade we decide to make out of the lemons that life gives us is really the most important thing.
Wow, that is so beautiful. Thank you for sharing that, Cynthia. I'm sure that your child is pretty awesome to have that perspective, and to have grown in that kind of way. It's very forward facing. It really is kind of the ultimate of what we need to do when we face difficult things, is to also recognize that we are built with the capacity to find our way forward. And it sounds like you've done, and your husband has done, a pretty amazing job at making that clear. It's really beautiful to hear you say that. I want to talk a little bit about Signe Novak, who's the founder of the MAID Family Support Society, which is an organization that provides support for those in the community who are navigating, going through the MAID decision. She wrote your foreword in the book, The Many Faces of MAID, where she says, my dad had a medically assisted death in 2018, just 2 years after it was legalized in Canada. And his final words to the physician were, keep doing the amazing work you're doing with MAID. And you've written this book. I wonder how much that reflects what you know about the work that is being done in the MAID field.
Yeah. So, yeah, Signe Novak is a wonderful woman. And in spite of some of the news that makes the headlines, that makes MAID sensational, I will say that I almost exclusively speak with people whose experiences with or emotions about MAID are varied, as demonstrated in the book, but who are glad that their person had the choice. Mm-hmm. So those words of Signe's, keep doing the good work that you're doing. From my perspective, I do think that the work that's being done is good work because it's giving people choice and it's giving people opportunities to say goodbye. It's giving people the chance to say goodbye in fashions that are acceptable to them. It's giving people opportunities to alleviate pain and suffering. It's giving people some control over a really difficult and uncontrollable time period of life. And, in spite of feeling bereft, guilty, angry, frustrated, people also feel empowered. They feel love, they feel connection, they feel joy and humor and togetherness. in these difficult moments. And I think it's, you know, part of the thing we tried to highlight in the book is that there's not just one feeling that happens when you go through something like this. There's a lot of feelings. It's the and capitalized A-N-D, where you both, you know, I like to be really clear that losing my husband was like the everything in life is now before and after he died. But him using MAID ultimately to end his life is not the thing that marked me or is most significant about our loss.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, having to face that and to realize that he was so unwell, I think he had brain cancer, right?
Correct, yeah.
Yeah, and it's a pretty horrific trajectory. I know I've had a really close friend who died of brain cancer, and you know it's horrific. It's horrible to watch it. It's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And if you look at the statistics for the numbers that we do have in Canada, the most recent numbers were released for the year 2022, and it was like 13,241 people who used MAID that year. And only 3.5% of those people were in a category that's called death not reasonably foreseeable. So what is that? 96.5% of those people's death were reasonably foreseeable.
Right. So
Which
that for
means,
that smaller percentage, the reason to go forward might have been that the pain was intolerable, but they may still live another year or so, you know, and, you know, what does that really look like? So I'm going to go to some of our emails from our,
sure.
shall I say, pretty awesome listeners who just ask pretty profound questions. This one is from Jim. And Jim says, wow, Dr. Anna, what a topic to discuss. It is a big topic. This is so important. A lot of us do not know what to do on this issue. And what to do on this issue depends on what country you're in, for sure, Jim. Jim says, I guess if pain is unbearable on the patient, that would be the best option. So this is what we're really talking about right now, Cynthia, that it isn't just pain, it's also whether you meet the criterion, because sometimes people can be in pretty profound pain and not be eligible. That's correct, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So the answer to that is hard to know, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Whether that's
And I
actually
guess
the right one.
the question, yeah, what was his question? What do we do about on this issue?
Yeah, well, Jim's question is, I guess if pain is unbearable on the patient, that would be the best option. So that's a question.
Yeah, well, and so I'll share an interesting fact. My husband did not experience physical pain at all, none, which is uncommon somewhat in brain cancer. I would pose the question to the listeners because I'm not here to advocate for my own position. I'm here to share sort of what I know and what I've seen. But I would pose the question, who defines pain and why do we prioritize pain we can see another person going through versus pain that perhaps we can't see? For my husband, it pained him tremendously psychologically to have lost his ability to speak and interact with myself and our children. It pained him tremendously to have lost the fine motor skills and control of the right side of his body to a degree. I mean, he could still move around, but for the kinds of work that he did and his passions, and it pained him tremendously psychologically to imagine his young children watching the trajectory of brain cancer play out as he would have progressed towards a death that wasn't one of his choosing and under his control. So he didn't experience any physical pain, but I don't think that that makes his choice any less valid.
Yeah, that's really helpful to know. But he met the criterion on another level in that he
he had a serious and incurable illness. He was in
right.
an advanced state of irreversible decline, and he had enduring psychological suffering caused by his illness that was in an advanced state of decline that was intolerable to him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Cynthia, I've got another really fantastic question, and I have actually an example that I know of. This is from Katie, and she says, "Hi, is religion an issue for this procedure?" I'm going to get you to answer in a second, Cynthia, but I want to relay something that I'm aware of. You know, there are some hospitals in the city of Toronto that actually do not allow for the intervention of MAID, and it is based on a position of religion that particular hospital takes. And I know that there are individuals who would meet the criterion, but unless they leave that hospital, it's not an option for them. Could you speak a little bit more about the issue of religion as an issue for this procedure that you're aware of?
Yeah, I guess so you just named one of them. We call them here in Canada institutional religious obstructions, where a religious institution uses their position as a provider of publicly funded healthcare to prevent people from services, not just MAID. There's other services like abortion or that go against the religion, and so they don't allow those services to take place on their facilities. That's a big one, especially in the West. I guess the other way religion would play into it is, and does play into it, and we see this at MAID Family Support Society. And I just wanted to clarify that we are an organization that provides peer support not to individuals choosing MAID, but to their family members, because we are peers to those people. So I speak regularly with other young women, usually with children, who have a spouse that's going to choose MAID or has chosen MAID. Mm-hmm. Anyway, we do hear from people where their family member or family was religious and they chose MAID, and now they don't have the support of their community, or maybe because they shared and they've been ostracized, or maybe because they decided not to share because they're the fear of being ostracized. I would say religion doesn't play so much outside the hospital setting into whether you can choose it or not. It plays into how well you and your family will move forward in the world or the community, feeling supported by the people around you. I think the stigma of MAID is reducing in cities. I'm not really sure about in rural settings. And so we often see people who can't share their loved one's choice or can't talk openly about their loved one's end of life, or their loved one didn't get to, say goodbye to all the people they wanted to, because that would require them to share the choice of how they were going to die ultimately. So I would say, yeah, it's a challenging situation that is stigmatized by religion for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Wow. This one is from Walt, who says, "So even if a family member or a patient wants to use this procedure, they cannot unless the doctor has okayed it."
Correct. The physician who will help you needs to ensure, it's their responsibility to ensure that you meet the eligibility criteria if they are going to help you. And maybe not to be flippant, but it's not illegal to die by your own hand. What's illegal is for a physician to help you die if they haven't made sure that you meet the criteria for getting help from a physician to die.
Mm-hmm. Like in a structured setting where the application is known and it has been pre-approved. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And yet, we hear stories like this that came before MAID was legalized in Canada, and we still hear stories like this that occur in, various countries around the world. But yes, if you want to use the actual MAID application, then it must go through this assessment. You must meet that criterion for this particular approach to be applied.
Right.
Yeah.
And not just one physician has to okay it. 2 physicians have to okay it. Yeah.
Right. The documentation has to be all, checked off and filed before you can initiate it within this system as it stands. So yeah. And there's checks and balances, and in a lot of ways, those checks and balances are actually good. Like I remember a number of years ago, because I do so much work with veterans, I recall a veteran saying to me, I was speaking to somebody at Veterans Affairs, and this made the news, so I'm not saying anything that is unknown, and you probably even know about it as well. That there was a time when there was somebody on the VAC lines, Veterans Affairs, who was saying, to veterans who were not actually critically ill, maybe you should consider MAID when they were presenting with, pretty severe post-traumatic stress or major depressive disorder or other mental health disorder or severe addiction. And obviously that was dealt with pretty quickly, but, kind of a shocking idea that somebody could suggest MAID when there are treatments, viable treatments that are available. So we don't want
Absolutely.
it to be
and I mean, I think that's just an awful experience for someone to have someone else suggest that. I mean, it's no worse than someone saying like, oh, your life sounds terrible, you should kill yourself. I mean, that's terrible and inappropriate and not acceptable. And I would just like to point out that it made a lot of headlines. And for someone like myself, who for 13,000, well, 96% of 13,000 people whose deaths were reasonably foreseeable that used MAID, those headlines did a lot of damage and added a lot of stigma to people who legitimately choose MAID through legal and viable channels. And it's awful for a Veterans Affairs line to say and suggest something like that. I just also want to make sure listeners are aware that no one answering a phone at Veterans Affairs was like mailing MAID out in the mail to someone.
No, that didn't happen.
Yes. That being the headlines that say they were offered MAID, like, well, someone mentioned MAID, and that's rude. But to actually have received MAID, those veterans would have had to submit a signed document witnessed asking for MAID and be assessed by 2 physicians, and they would not have been found eligible.
But the horrible part was just the recommendation or the suggestion.
Absolutely,
that
not
these
acceptable.
are the steps that you could take to apply for MAID when somebody's presenting as emotionally distraught or really suffering with post-traumatic stress.
That's not acceptable.
Yeah, so I mean, these things do happen. I know it was dealt with pretty quickly, but there are a lot of people who encountered this that did not speak out. They weren't part of the whole media cycle that was involved in that. There were people who were kind of behind the scenes who had encountered it. There's another one. This is really an important conversation, and I always know that because of the amount of emails that we get. This is from John, who asks, how is this done with drugs, injection, gas? John is curious how is this done?
So again, I'm not a medical professional, just need to, and I don't administer MAID, but it's done by injection. So in Canada, it is it's done by injection, and there's resources online. You can Google the Government of Canada website and find out exactly which are the medications that are administered. But basically, the 2 I've been present for, your loved one falls asleep very quickly, and then a medicine is administered that stops their heart, I guess, and then they die.
So
I mean, that's exactly how it's done.
The medicine to help them fall asleep is injected first so that they are already asleep when the second dose is applied.
Yes.
Got it. Okay. So that is an important thing for people to understand as well. This is from Monica. Fantastic show today. See, isn't that interesting? We're talking about such a serious topic, Cynthia, and you had started by saying that you're passionate about talking about difficult topics, and then Monica says, fantastic show topic today, right? So we know that people are hungry for these kinds of conversations. So in all actuality, is it up to the physician to okay this, not the family or the patient? So there's two steps though, right? I mean, it's not so straightforward. Do you want to talk about that, Cynthia?
Yeah, so ultimately it's up to the patient to request it, and then it's up to the patient and only the patient. It has to be one of the eligibility criteria is that it's a voluntary request. And then it is up to the physicians, plural, to approve to check that they're eligible and approve it. And then it's finally back in the patient's hands to choose to go forward. And that there's multiple steps along the way where points in which a patient can choose to go forward or not, up until the very last moment where the doctor checks again is, are you sure this is what you want? And maybe just to kind of switch gears for a second, and what we talk a lot in the book is not really like a blog where you hear 17 people's chronological stories. The book is more an acknowledgement, but via 17 people's, small snippets of their experiences, the different emotions that come up along the way. And I speak quite openly in the book about the feelings that are a little harder to address or to acknowledge or to admit to having had. And one of those being, these checks and balances are fantastic and they're necessary. Please don't interpret me as to be saying they're not necessary. But when you're a supportive patient, family member of a dying loved one who's struggling, who's, only awake a few hours a day, who is struggling to communicate or in pain, these checks and balances are also quite onerous and stressful and very difficult. It's very difficult for someone who struggles to communicate to have to plead their case 2 times for like an hour and a half, plead their case. I mean, no, to answer the questions and to satisfy the medical professional's legal obligation that you meet the eligibility criteria, but that requires you to answer a lot of questions. It's an emotional process. You have to demonstrate you understand what you're asking for, that you understand your diagnosis, that you understand your treatment options. You have to make sure that you've somehow communicate to the physician, like why you're in pain or why that treatment's not acceptable to you or why this is the choice that you wish to pursue. And you have to do that twice. And then along the way, you're repeatedly asked by the physicians, like, are you sure this is what you want? Do you consent to this? Are you sure you want to proceed? And as a loved one who's sitting there, like facilitating often, I mean, who else is making the phone calls or faxing the documents or sending the emails or opening the door to allow the physicians into the house or making the tea or serving the cookies or, helping your loved one like to the couch or helping them have a shower to feel presentable, to meet another doctor or helping interpret, but not too much because this has to be a voluntary choice. It's really, really emotionally taxing and exhausting and hard because I want to be clear, I did not want my husband to die. Mm-hmm. But I 100% supported his choice because he was going to die anyway. And I supported him dying like this, that rather than dying like that. But I was still trying to come to terms with the fact that, oh my God, my husband's going to die. I'm going to be a widow at 40. I'm going to be the mother of 2 young children for the rest of my life. I will be their only parent. I mean, you have all of these other things that you're trying to navigate and come to terms with. And not to mention parenting 2 young kids who are hard enough at the best of times, but who also know their father's going to die. And then you add to this all of these checks and balances, which are important and they are necessary and they are critical to a system that can function well and serve all of the people that it serves, but also they're hard.
Yeah, it's a really heartbreaking story, Cynthia, and the fact that you had to face this. And it almost sounds like, when you're talking about it, it kind of sounds like a choice of loving him enough that you didn't want him to suffer more than he would have.
And I almost exclusively hear from people who are similarly like, I'm trying to parse apart what is my grief over just the situation that my loved one's dying, and what is my actual specific grief or emotions related to MAID, because they're all intertwined, because most of the time it's your loved one's dying anyway. They're sick and they're dying. And the fact that they chose MAID might be a surprise, or it might be come from left field, or you might not have a lot of time. But anyway, your person has both told you, I'm dying, and oh, I'm dying on Tuesday.
Mm-hmm.
And which, it's like your head just spins. But is it spinning because they're choosing MAID, or is it spinning because they're dying, or is it spinning because of both?
I want to go back to the book because the way it was put together, there are all these chapters that help explore different phases of MAID. But the part that I thought was so kind of beautifully broken down was the different emotions that people can have at different stages. And, you go through a list of really common emotions: denial and shock, confusion and fear, apprehension, helplessness, discouragement, anger, betrayal. I see a lot of betrayal when people talk about MAID: sadness, hopelessness, loneliness, abandonment, empathy, and love. And it's interesting how you can face all these things throughout that trajectory when facing MAID, and, depending on the story that people are going through. Like I've had an interesting experience. I wonder what you make of this. Like right now, I mean, I've had other clients who've gone through this in different ways, but right now I have 3 clients who are either contemplating or facing the potential of a MAID decision in their own lives. And I hear gratitude and relief as the most often cited response from those considering the option for themselves, and fear, betrayal, and anger as the more common from loved ones choosing this option. So like people who have a loved one who's choosing the option, they may have very different feelings. Can you speak to like the different positions and the different impact on relationships during that time?
I can try. I would say that in my experience, the loved ones also feel gratitude and relief. However, I think when we structured the book, we played around with different ways of ordering the storytellers. And at one time we thought, well, maybe it will be better for continuity in each chapter if you hear from people in the same order.
Mm-hmm.
But that ended up with us in one chapter, I think, I can't remember which one, but one of the ones like saying goodbye, or the day of right after. The first story was love. And it felt very disingenuous. Like, what's a reader going to think if they pick up a book to open to this chapter where they're most likely feeling sad or angry, and the first thing they read is love. Like they're going to feel like, you don't understand me. This is like, what kind of book is this?
Right,
And we
like
had to really,
minimizing something that's such a big deal. I mean,
so we
yes,
had to,
I read some of the stories, and the big picture at the end seemed to be about love, but it's not reasonable to look at that and think this stands alone, when it's just not going to be an easy process for anybody, but it may be
right.
the process.
So we had to go back and decided to, within each chapter, organize it by sort of what we deem to be kind of the more expected common feelings, most common to least common, because we did want to present the range of emotions, but we thought it's a lot more empathetic to try to present it from the perspective, I guess, of the masses, of where one might most likely think they'd feel at the time. So all of that to say, though, that when you are a recently bereft widow, I think it is not very couth or appropriate to say, I'm so relieved.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you kind of sound like a jerk. But the truth is, everybody feels a sense of relief afterwards, for a moment or an hour or snippets here and there, that it's an emotion that does exist. I mean, you've gone from probably being a caregiver like 24 hours a day on top of everything else, and there is a piece of you that will feel relieved. That is not the emotion that you're expected to talk about. So equally, someone choosing MAID does feel fear and they feel guilt. I know my father and my husband both, but that's the second you say, I'm scared or I'm uncertain or I feel guilty, everyone jumps and says, well, are you sure this is what you want to do? Because there's not space in society for us to feel both relieved and grateful and fearful that we're going to die. So I guess this is my roundabout way of saying, do I agree with you that the people choosing MAID feel relief and gratitude, and the people surrounding that person feel betrayed, anger, and sad? Well, yes, but we also live in a society that has designed that that's the way we're supposed to talk about death. We are
Yeah,
not
I'm sorry.
supposed...
I didn't mean it to make it sound like a rubric, a this or a that. I think there's the range of emotion. It's just I keep consistently seeing people talking about it like this or like that. And
Yeah, and I think
the response sequence tends to be different depending on whether you're seeking MAID or you have a family member seeking
Sure.
MAID. The responses, I'm not talking about the aftermath. I'm talking about as people are contemplating the procedure, that these are the things that I'm hearing, that I keep hearing. And I just find it very, it's very interesting.
And probably the loved ones who talk about any of the emotions like gratitude or love or relief are quickly follow that with feeling very guilty for having felt that way. Or, I mean, are more, a patient who's choosing it has probably had a lot longer to think about this and get their heads around the idea, where a loved one usually has had a lot less time when they start having these discussions. It's a newer topic in their life, or a newer revelation that this is going to happen.
Yeah, it sure makes the issue of mortality come up pretty fast, even if there's a 2 or 3 year timeline. As soon as somebody starts talking about MAID, it brings it home pretty quickly. I want to talk a little bit about your book again, because people are asking, and this came from Edward. Does your guest have a book? And yes, there is a book. It's by Cynthia Clark and Carol Cram, The Many Faces of MAID, What to Expect When Someone You Know Chooses Medical Assistance in Dying. It is available on Amazon, and I think it has some pretty relevant stories that could help most people who are thinking about this route, either for themselves or a loved one is thinking about this, to kind of give you a sense of the range of emotions that people feel really regularly, and to help you maybe grapple a little bit with it. But the other thing in the book, which is really well developed, are your resources that, talk about eligibility information, national organizers. So there's the MAID Family Support Society, the Canadian Association of MAID Assessors and Providers. There's Dying with Dignity, MAID House, Bridge C 14, and Canada Virtual Hospice. And there are provincial resources as well that are available in here. And, I think just the stories themselves are really worth people kind of reading and understanding. And, I find it really interesting as a practitioner that I'm seeing this more and more in my own practice, that, if you're a professional, you may find that you're seeing it more and more with your clients or your patients. What does that mean for you? And, reading something like this may be very helpful. So, that is definitely something to think about. So Amazon, and is it available anywhere else, Cynthia?
The best way to get the book is off of Amazon. A lot of public libraries have it. Like you said, all the proceeds from the book go to support MAID Family Support Society, which right now is a 100% volunteer-run organization that anyone out there with lived experience in Canada with MAID is welcome to volunteer. And anyone out there who's going through this with a family member is welcome to self-refer for support, from peer support. We're not professional helpers. But yeah, it's a grassroots organization. Many of the people in the book volunteer for the organization, and we just virtually chat with people who just need a listening ear or someone to talk to.
Is it that the most of the volunteers have lived experience?
All of the volunteers have lived experience because we are peer support. So we don't offer peer support to people choosing MAID for themselves because we are not peers to those people. We just offer peer support to people like ourselves who, a lot of us kind of wished we could talk to someone who'd been through it. And now we have over 60, 70 volunteers across Canada. And this year alone, we've supported close to 300 people.
Wow, that's a very effective network for sure. This email is from Howard, who says, I'm an avid listener to your radio show, and I must admit this is the most depressing and sad show that I have ever heard. And I am very sad now. And I join you in that, Howard. This is a very sad topic. But, I think it's really true, what you said at the beginning. You started perfectly, that you are a passionate advocate of having difficult conversations. And sometimes those are difficult conversations that we wouldn't otherwise get an opportunity to have, because, I think in our culture, we actually tend to not talk about these difficult conversations relating to death and dying. We have in our culture actually a death aversion culture. So we tend not to talk about it. Some of us tend not to plan for it very well. And we have a lot of conversations that go forward with just within ourselves alone. So we're grappling with these things all on our own. And I agree with you. It is a really sad topic. And Howard goes on to say, it's a very important topic, but very depressing to say the least. My thoughts are with your guests. So thank you so much, Howard, for saying that.
Thank you, Howard. And I would just like to tell you, Howard, that I think death is the sad topic, and MAID specifically doesn't have to be. My father died in his favorite chair in the living room with all of his grandchildren, had come to say goodbye. He kissed all his stuffies and left his love with them. My brother and I and my mother had a bottle of wine. We toasted, we laughed. We confirmed which is the favorite child and which isn't, had a laugh, and a hug and a kiss, and said goodbye, and listened to his favorite song as we held his hand. And, yes, it was sad, but I didn't run home to take a shower and miss saying goodbye to my father. It was also acceptable and peaceful and kind.
Wow, that's really something. Cynthia, we have 1 minute left. I want to know if there's anything you feel that our listeners would benefit from hearing from you before we log off, and know that I will be in touch because I want to have more conversations with you on this really important topic. And thank you for joining us.
I would just like to say, keep talking about hard things, because polarizing it doesn't change anything, and understanding one another and everybody who is involved, everyone who's touched by death and by MAID, goes through a lot of emotions. And we at MAID Family Support Society would love more volunteers. We would love you to read the book. We would love donations. We'd love you to tell your friends who need support to call us.
Thank you so much.
We want people to feel supported.
Thank you so much, Cynthia, and all of our wonderful listeners today. Your emails were incredible, and there were too many for us to go through. I look forward to speaking with you all next month. And everybody, be well, take care of yourself, and enjoy the day as much as you can.
Thank you for listening to the Bear Psychology Radio Show with your host, psychologist, Dr. Anna Baranowski, right here on Reality Radio 101.